Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in Freshman Honors English, and we turn now in our study to the Odyssey. So let's go there now for a few moments. This is introductory comments. We have finished with our study of Edith Hamilton's mythology, and more particularly part 4 of Edith Hamilton's mythology. That for us is the central heart, if you will, of that text, reminding you that text gives us some really important information in the opening pages because it kind of outlines the primary characters that we call the gods and goddesses of Greek myth. Then it gives us a number of stories about lovers, stories about whatever, heroes or whatever. And then finally, we get to the heart of Edith Hamilton's mythology, part 4, which she called the Troy Tale. And we as well reference as the Troy Tale. Now, what we're going to do is pick up our study of Homer's Odyssey, and we'll be working with Fitzgerald's translation out of our textbook. We'll get there by the end of our comments right now. Before we get there, though, let's just make sure that we review a couple of important pieces of information. If you're following this lecture, however, and you've not watched my earlier lectures on Hamilton's mythology, hit learnstrong.net and make sure and watch those. Down that left-hand side, you can find the folder, in fact, that says Hamilton's mythology, or you can go directly to the freshman folder and you can scroll down to find those lectures posted as well. Let's remind ourselves that in Edith Hamilton's mythology part 4, what she calls collectively the Troy Tale, she will tell stories that are of 3 kinds. Those stories which are pre-Iliadic, that is to say, before the Iliad, those stories which are contained in the Iliad, and then finally those stories that are post-Iliadic, after the Iliad itself. Let's review those real quickly, just to make sure that we're all on board. We have, of course, the pre-Iliadic stories, right? And those pre-Iliadic stories for us are of several important pieces. One, the judgment of Paris. Paris decides to give that golden apple to Aphrodite, and therefore Hera and Athena are really upset, and that will predetermine that Troy will fall. The city of Troy is central to our story called the Troy Tale, obviously that great city, and it's inevitable it's going to fall. It's just a matter of time, it's just a matter of when. Number 2, once Helen is taken from Menelaus, king of Sparta, then he will call his brother Agamemnon, and together they will combine or amass all of the Greek troops. However, we've got a couple of stories that will attend that early pre-Iliadic, before the actual Iliad begins, that are, of course, important. One of those has to do with Agamemnon himself. He will sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, to be able to take his troops away and go fight at the walls of Troy. We want to hold that, of course, because a post-Iliadic story will be his return, and when he comes back home to Mama, Clytemnestra, it ain't going to turn out well for him. We've also got the story of Odysseus. This is important for our notes. Let's make sure we have it. Odysseus doesn't want to go and fight at the walls of Troy. He pretends like he's insane, and it takes Agamemnon to actually catch him in his crafty deception, right? Or Odysseus would have stayed in Ithaca with his beautiful wife Penelope and his young son Telemachus. He's got no interest in going. One of the reasons is because he knows in his heart of hearts that if he leaves Ithaca, he will not be back directly. As a matter of fact, for Odysseus, and that's the hero of our text we're about to study, it will take him 10 years at the walls of Troy. Finally, Troy will fall in the 10th year. And then it will take him 10 more years to come home. So for 20 years, Odysseus will be gone from his island home of Ithaca, his beautiful wife Penelope, and no longer an infant son Telemachus, right? So by the time we pick up with the story of the Odyssey, Telemachus is no young boy anymore. As a matter of fact, when Odysseus left, he told Penelope, if our boy starts to get hair on his face, take another husband, I am dead. Which will be a really, be difficult for Penelope, because nobody will know, is Odysseus dead, is Odysseus alive? We'll get to it. Finally, of course, we will have the classic text of the Iliad itself. Let's talk for a few seconds about that. The Iliad is a text about death. The Iliad is a text about violence. Now, in your senior year, we will, of course, study together in AP English. We will study the Iliad closely. And you can see lectures in the learnstrong.net in the AP folder specific to every book of the Iliad, okay, that can allow you to start to get ready for that study here in 3 or 4 years hence, all right? The Iliad is a text where fundamentally just a couple of days out of the end of the war are told. 3 important things happen. 1, Agamemnon and Achilles have a fight over a girl, and Agamemnon will return the girl that he has taken, Chryses, and he will steal from Achilles' girl, Briseis. In the process of doing that, Achilles withdraws from the war. And Achilles asks Zeus, through his mother Thetis, who is a goddess, that the Greeks will be punished for their shaming of Achilles by taking away his girl. Number two, the second major motif or storyline in the Iliad is that the Trojans win. With the help of Zeus and a number of other gods, especially Apollo and Ares, the Trojans win. They start to win through Hector, the greatest warrior of the Trojans, and get all the way down to their ships and start setting their ships on fire. Remember, the ships are wood, yes? So in other words, the Greeks had to sail to get there. Dude, you burn their ships, they got problems. They got nowhere to go. In other words, the Trojans will win the war. Patroclus, the best friend of Achilles, will enter the war. He will wear Achilles' armor. He will fight against Hector. He will lose. In losing, Hector will take Achilles' armor. The body of Patroclus, although Hector wants to keep that body, ultimately is returned back to Achilles. The final part of the Iliad is, of course, the inevitable contest. Namely, the Iliad is a poem about two men, warriors, who inevitably are going to come at each other. You know that ultimately Achilles, he comes out, by the way, of his, being angry about losing Briseis. Once he loses his best friend Patroclus, and Achilles is enraged. He will kill everything in sight that's Trojan. Okay? And finally, Hector and Achilles, in front of the walls of Troy, will fight. Three important things. One, Hector will ask Achilles, before we fight, can you please agree with me that whoever wins will return the body? Two, Achilles will say, I am going to crush you. I would eat your body raw if I could do it and get away with it. That's how enraged Achilles is. Three, Achilles will in fact kill Hector right in front of his father, king of Troy, Priam, right in front of his mother, Hecuba, and then he will take the body and he will do all kinds of nasties to the body. He'll drag it around the battlefield. In other words, Achilles wants to prove once and for all that he is the winner and that Hector will pay for killing his best friend. The Iliad will end with the gods none too pleased with this treatment of the body of Hector by Achilles. And the king of Troy, Priam, under cover of night, will come into the tent of Achilles. I mean, think about what that means. All Achilles has to do is draw his sword, cut off the head of the king, and the war is ended. It's done. And Troy will fall at that point. But in that moment, Achilles shows compassion, pity. He can't believe that the old man is coming and kissing his hand, Achilles' hand, and begging for the body of his son back. Priam himself says this. He goes, what kind of a father would ever have to go through begging the murderer of his own son, and many other sons? Achilles has killed a lot of Priam's sons, to beg for the body back. The reason why Priam wants the body back is so that he can bury the body appropriately, so that the soul of Hector can go down into the underworld appropriately, etc., etc. And at the very end of the Iliad, and this is critical, Achilles decides he will give the body back, and the body of Hector is returned, and the final line of the Iliad is, in fact, they buried the body of the great Achilles. That's how the Iliad ends. No fall of Troy, no death narrative of Achilles, none of the, what we now call, post-Iliadic stories. Now, they've been referenced throughout the entire Iliad while you're reading the Iliad. Achilles is constantly talked about as a guy who's soon to die, which is remarkable because he's got this like amazing coating on him because his mama Thetis dropped him into that river Styx in the underworld. So it's like, how are you going to die? And yet, constantly spoken of, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, it's coming, one of those kinds of things. We also have the sense that we know Troy is going to fall. It's an inevitability that Troy is going to fall. How are they going to get inside those huge walls? That's going to be part of post-Iliadic stories. Okay? After the Iliad are post-Iliadic stories, now to finish our review. Our post-Iliadic stories are of several kinds. One, there are many of them, but I'm just going to hit a few of them. One, the death of Achilles. Achilles, ironically, and it is ironically, Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greeks, is going to be killed by Paris, a warrior who is the brother of Hector, who is of course the one responsible for this silly thing in the first place, because he's the one that took Helen away from Sparta and Menelaus and all of that. But it will be Paris who will shoot an arrow at Achilles, And he doesn't really think much about arrows coming at him. And when he is wounded in the ankle, for the first time, he feels a different kind of pain and blood. And all of a sudden, we come to realize the irony. That when he was dipped as a lad into the river Styx, his mother was holding on to his ankle. That's the only spot that didn't get that special Teflon coating of the river Styx. That's his one vulnerable spot. So we even talk about it, right, as your Achilles heel. Literally, you do have an Achilles tendon in your body, no question. But your Achilles heel, it's that vulnerability that you possess, but you don't know that you possess it. Until, of course, it's too late and then you're jacked, right? And Achilles will die. It's with the death of Achilles the Greeks are done. So our second major story post-Iliadic is, of course, what happens after Achilles dies? The Greeks are ready to leave. Odysseus is the one that says, we'll win by cheating. Now, since we're going to study the Odyssey, it's significant that we point out, it is Odysseus who invents the idea of cheating. Three-part cheating. One, we're going to pretend like we sail away in our ships. We're going to let the Trojans see this. Okay, they've given up. Two, we're going to build this huge wooden horse, or for Monty Python fans, this large wooden badger. We're going to crawl up inside, and we're going to leave somebody outside of the horse to lie and say, this is a good luck sacrifice, so the Greeks will have good luck going home. The Greeks will then say they have left. The Trojans will want the good luck sacrifice. They will push the horse inside of the city. So you understand that there's a literal rendering of the Trojan horse, that is to say, pushing the horse inside the city of Troy. But there's a metaphoric understanding as well of what the Trojan horse means. The Trojan horse, of course, then is any time something affects you, and you invite it in, but you don't realize that it's going to do you naughty or nasties. You don't get it. You don't know. But it's going to happen. And when it happens, it will destroy you. And of course, that's exactly what happens. The city of Troy will fall, and the destruction is horrific. Okay? Another one of the stories that will be significant is the journey of the great warrior Aeneas. Mentioned several times in the Iliad as a great and mighty Trojan warrior, Aeneas gets away. He escapes. He's going to stay and sacrifice his life, but instead he elects, with the help of the gods, to leave. This is told in a famous epic poem called the Aeneid by the Roman poet Virgil. That you will want in your notes. That's important. In your senior year of AP, then, we will turn to the Iliad. We will, of course, also turn to the Odyssey. And then finally, we will turn to Virgil's Aeneid. Lectures provided as well on LearnStrong.net in the AP folder. All right? Of course, we do have the homecoming of Agamemnon, the guy who jacked his own daughter, Iphigenia, right? And when he arrives, Clytemnestra is going to take care of her business by fooling Agamemnon into believing that she's totally forgotten about what it was her husband did to their daughter. She invites him in, and then she jacks him, right? And she takes care of her business. Ultimately, the plays that tell this story will tell about the son of Agamemnon, all right, who is ultimately interested. He's going to come and he's going to get vengeance. Talk about your dysfunctional family. But now, finally, the story that's the most famous of the post-Iliad stories is, of course, the story of Odysseus. By the way, Odysseus' name in Latin is Ulysses. So when in our senior year we studied the great poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson called Ulysses, we're actually talking about this same cat named Odysseus. Odysseus is his Greek name, Ulysses is his Latin name, all right? Now the story of the homecoming of Odysseus is really an important story in the history of Western thought, okay? And as we get into our conversation about this text, we're going to be asking then about how the Odyssey as a poem is different from the Iliad as a poem. I would write that down. The Odyssey as a poem, different from the Iliad as a poem. Now, even though as freshmen we don't actually read the Iliad, we simply work with Edith Hamilton's mythology, and we kind of wait until our senior year to actually pick up the reading of the Iliad. We will actually pick up parts of the reading of the Odyssey. We're not reading the entire text. Put that in your notes. We're only reading parts of the text, okay? Edith Hamilton's mythology, part 4, that Troy tale, will flesh out most of the detail of the stories. Now we actually pick up the very lines of the poetry itself, all right? So as we're taking a look now at our text, that's where we will go. Now, just really quickly, how will we do this study? One, we will obviously be doing our own reading prior to class, where we will be working with that annotation levels of what does the text say, level 1, what does the text mean, level 2, themes, messages, 2A, rhetoric, 2B, and then finally at level 3, how can I relate to a text like this? Namely at 3A, how can I relate to other texts? 3B, how can I relate to myself? Then when we come to class, we'll be working together with the text itself and even with a reading of the text itself. So we'll be listening to a professional reading of the lines from your textbook, and again, we'll be engaging in the text that way. All right? Let's turn now to the textbook in our final seconds, and you should be with me on page 1040A and following. And I just want to point out a few things now going forward, all right? The first thing that I want to point out to you on 1040A and following, 1040A and following, notice you got some historical background about ancient Greece. Make sure you read that, especially that whole thing about the Mycenaeans as well as the Minoans. Then over onto page 1040B, I want you to take a look at that map really quickly and identify two things. Look where Troy is. Do you see it? Present-day Turkey today, right? Do you see that? All right. So look where Troy is. Look where Athens is, and that gives you a sense. Athens is, of course, the great city of the Greeks, okay? Again, I'm with you on 1040B, okay? 1040B. So you've got a little map there. So you can kind of see the wall, the Troy is there to the east. So we're going to sail, if we're from Sparta, or from Mycenae, or from Athens, right? We're going to sail, or even Crete. We're going to sail then east to find Troy. That's where the war will take place. Now, of course, we've got then the return that's going to take place from Troy back then going west. That's Ithaca. By the way, did you notice where Mount Olympus was? Do you see it? North there. If you'll turn the page to 1040C, you've got the introduction to Greek mythology and customs. Now, while I want you to read this will be really for you a brief summary in comparison to what you've read in Hamilton's mythology. And then look it over on page 1040D. There's your gods in Greek mythology, and of course that's the first part of Edith Hamilton's mythology. We have done that in far greater detail. However, I want you to be familiar with all of those different gods and goddesses as you pick up your text here, right? Okay, so that you're good to go. Go ahead and flip the page to 1040E. One of the challenges for scholars for many, many years is to answer the simple question, who is Homer? Like, who is this cat? So we're going to give a name to a poet that we're not even sure who this poet was. We're not even sure if it's a single poet, but put it in your notes. One of the things we now feel pretty confident about is that before this text was written down, it was an oral text. In other words, poets, bards, memorized this text and recited or repeated it as a form of storytelling entertainment. At some point, right, it was finally written down. There's some debate about exactly when, and your textbook is going to kind of walk you through that one. Okay? Then on 1040F, we've got the important word epic. The idea of an epic, this long narrative poem. In other words, it's a poem that's going to tell a story. Can I say this out loud? The difference between reading Edith Hamilton's Mythology Part 4, the Troy Tale, and picking up the Odyssey and reading it is that we're actually reading the poem here. When you're reading Edith Hamilton's mythology, you're just reading prose, right? It's kind of like reading a novel or a short story. But when you pick up this text, you want to make sure that you understand. You're reading a poem, an epic poem. Notice we've got several elements to the epic poem listed for you on 1040F. Of course, the opening invocation to the muse, we'll talk about in a moment. The starting of the story in medias res, which means we begin right in the middle of the action. The great Roman poet Horace said, that's the best way to begin a poem. Okay? It kind of catches you right into it. We've got lofty style, we've got objective tone, we've got meter, we've got epithet, we've got epic simile. The epic simile you definitely want to write down. We're going to see that one a lot. Go ahead and turn to the next study page in your textbook really quickly, over to 1041. This is your literary analysis 2B topic. Okay? For our first set of readings, we will be focusing on the epic hero. So you want to write that down. And we're going to focus on this idea of, do you see it on 1041 under literary analysis, the flashback. Okay? We'll talk about the narrative structure of the Odyssey a little bit later, but the flashback is important. Events that have already occurred for Odysseus and his warriors are then going to be retold in the form of a flashback story that happens a little past the middle of the text, all right? Also notice that we've got the historical and cultural context information on 1041, as well as the use of background and prior knowledge. No question, your study of reading Edith Hamilton's mythology, especially part 4, will aid you immensely in your study here. I'll prove that to you. Look over onto page 1042. The vocabulary listed there you want to know for the examination, so pay attention to that. 1043 will introduce you to the Trojan War, and of course the Troy tale as we have outlined it and articulated it, okay? Over to 1045. We here now are with the introductory lines of the Odyssey. And then if you'll turn to 1046, there are your primary characters, all right? Let's begin first of all on 1045 with the opening verses. This is what we call the invocation of the muse. Write it down. The invocation of the muse. What we mean here, to invoke the muse, means that the poet will ask the goddess, the muse, will you please help me to tell this story? Okay? And it begins, sing in me, muse, and through me, tell the story of that man, Odysseus, skilled in all ways of contending. He's a struggle, a fighter. The wanderer. We want to write that down. Of course, Odysseus is his name. An odyssey is a journey, right? And so in our thinking in Western thought, it's impossible to separate the two, right? The wanderer, harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy. He saw the townlands and learned the minds of many distant men and weathered many bitter nights and days in his deep heart at sea.